Like George Costanza, I'm not a marine biologist, but I'm appealing to you from my heart to help save the southern resident killer whales from bright extinction. I'm from the south coast of BC, or British Columbia, in the Pacific Northwest of Canada. Whether you're Canadian or not, this issue has impacts for our planet Earth. I'm appealing to people as global citizens to help push for science-supported recovery measures in the southern residents' legally designated critical habitat. This whale population was listed as endangered under Canada's Species at Risk Act in 2002. They are now critically endangered. Defending their ecosystem biodiversity so this species can recover means don't add new threats, plus lower existing threats. And by that, I mean environmental pollution. That's not happening. But we can help turn the tide. Raincoast Conservation Foundation states, southern resident killer whales have transcended their status as iconic symbols of the Pacific Northwest, becoming ecological sentinels that serve as a warning about the health of our coast, our fisheries, and our collective stewardship. Although recovery is still within reach, it will not be achieved by perpetuating the status quo. Earlier this year, the Canadian government announced its 2025 protection measures for southern resident killer whales. Although well-intentioned, these maintain the harmful status quo. Threats would remain about the same as now, with no expected recovery from imminent extinction. It gets worse. Governments in BC and Canada are waiving marine environmental impact assessments to fast-track projects that will add threats, disturbances, and pollution instead of protecting the southern residents' critical habitat for current and future generations. In 2025, an independent panel of 31 international scientists from Canada, the USA, and the European Union specifically asked, what will it take to save this species? The David Suzuki Foundation and Raincoast Conservation Foundation released their report with 26 science-based actionable recommendations to help strengthen southern resident killer whale recovery. In a recent news article, US-based orca scientist Dr. Deborah Giles said, they're an ecosystem indicator. Everything causing their decline is our fault, so it's our responsibility to help them recover. In Canada, scientists agree that southern resident killer whales are vital to the health of entire ecosystems. We can't say, if only we had known the southern residents were at risk, we'd have saved them. The science is abundantly clear that extinction will happen under current conditions. Current negative human impacts are killing this species off. Disturbance and pollution from upcoming projects like Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will make the bright extinction risk worse. Are we willing to act fast to save them? Scientists talk about dark extinction for species where we don't have historical data. We don't really know what threats made them go extinct in the past. As described in a 2024 Raincoast Conservation Foundation update, bright extinction is where there is ample scientific data with clearly documented threats, but humans are doing nothing to halt the decline. Southern resident killer whales will be a bright extinction because they are among the best studied cetacean populations in the world. We know them so well that in 2019, at a Raincoast Conservation Foundation live stream on southern resident killer whale recovery, Misty McDuffie said, this will be the first extinction where we know the name of every member of the species. Southern residents are the smallest orca ecotype in the eastern Pacific Ocean. In a healthy population, scientists estimate there should be about 150 to 200 in this species. So some people say their extinction doesn't matter because there will still be other killer whales. While there are other species of transient killer whales or orcas on Earth, the southern residents are a genetically and culturally distinct population with their own language dialect. Unlike many other orcas that eat fish and seals, southern residents mainly eat salmon, especially Chinook. The whales have strong family ties, living in 3 pods, J, K, and L. Each pod is an extended family of mothers and their offspring. When they are all together, it's called a superpod. We know every individual, their age, and their female lineage dating back decades. The southern residents have deep spiritual and cultural significance to First Nations on lands now called Canada and the USA. Steve Edwards of the Swinomish tribe in Washington State says, "We consider the orcas, or blackfish, part of the whole web that connects us as a tribe to all living things." Scientists have clearly defined multiple threats to southern resident killer whale critical habitat in the Salish Sea. Decades of science prove this unique species is dying off in front of the world, while authorities and decision makers keep failing to protect them from negative human impacts. These are preventable impacts, including unhealthy underwater pollution from chemicals like PCBs, microplastics, and harmful noise exposures from shipping, boat, and vessel traffic. Scientists say it's not too late to save the southern resident killer whales. Critical habitat. The southern resident population was listed as endangered under Canada's Species at Risk Act in 2002 and is listed as endangered in the USA. Now they're critically endangered. We know their most threatened habitat is the coastal waters of the Pacific Northwest, especially in and around the Salish Sea. In 2012, a legal challenge by EcoJustice, the Canadian Federal Court of Appeal confirmed that the government must legally protect all aspects of critical habitat in Canada, including quality of the marine environment, such as acoustic disturbance. This isn't happening. This map from ResearchGate.net shows the southern resident killer whale range designated critical habitat by Canada in 2009 and by the USA in 2006. Critical habitat in Canadian waters is shown in red and US waters in black. If you've ever spent time on the islands, coast, or coastal waters off southern British Columbia or Washington State, you may have been lucky enough to see some southern resident killer whales. But 100 years from now, will future generations still share our planet with this unique species? Critically endangered. Southern resident killer whales are listed as critically endangered because there are only 74 left on the planet based on a 2025 census reported by the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. If the southern resident killer whale population drops below 30, they will become functionally extinct with not enough whales left for the species to recover. A 2017 study found southern resident killer whales had a 25% chance of functional extinction within 100 years if nothing is done to protect them. A recent reevaluation of the data found that since nothing has been done, the risk has increased since then. Dying calves. I've seen news articles saying there's hope for the southern residents after a new calf is born. New calves do not mean hope without habitat recovery measures. There are too many deaths overall. 70% of southern resident pregnancies fail, with a third of those failing in late pregnancy or near full term. In September 2025, researchers from the American-based Center for Whale Research spotted southern resident killer whale Alki from J-Pod pushing the body of her dead female calf in the waters off Vancouver Island, BC. They believe the calf died about 3 days earlier. This has been called a tour of grief. It's what extinction looks like. In 2018, mother whale Taliqua received international attention after keeping her dead newborn calf with her in a tour of grief that lasted over 2 weeks. The Canada-based Raincoast Conservation Foundation called this recent 2025 calf death a devastating loss for the southern resident killer whales. Canadian news media is currently more focused on proposals for new pipelines to British Columbia than another dead baby whale from a critically endangered species. There was certainly little media attention or international tears in 2025 for Alki's tour of grief, like there was in 2018 for Taliqua. Premature deaths. The southern resident salmon food supply is in decline, and their waters are noisy and polluted. This has resulted in the low calf survival and premature deaths of adult whales. Whales have a hard time feeding because it's so noisy underwater. It's harder to echolocate to find salmon. Wild salmon populations, especially Chinook, must also increase or recover for southern resident survival. As well as being poorly fed, the noise, chemical and microplastics pollution underwater means these whales are unhealthy. Nowadays, few adults live past 50 years old, dying much younger than their natural 90 to 100-year lifespan. Whales are also injured and killed by boat, ferry, ship, and tanker propeller strikes. The Orca Network population census shows that since 1990, 61 southern residents were born and survived, but almost twice as many, 113 whales, were confirmed dead or missing and presumed dead. That's not sustainable for species recovery. The 2025 Independent Science Panel report on strengthening recovery actions for southern resident killer whales recommends science-supported targeted priorities to help restore their natural ecosystem and defend biodiversity. This report is clear. Improving the southern resident killer whale habitat is essential, not optional, because they will go extinct under current harmful conditions caused by humans. What will it take to save the southern resident killer whales? In March 2025, 31 killer whale, salmon, and conservation scientists from Canada, the United States, and the European Union met in Vancouver, BC, Canada, to consider one question: what will it take to save the southern resident killer whales? The science-backed answer is in their report titled Independent Science Panel on Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery 2025, Strengthening Recovery Actions for Southern Resident Killer Whales. The report makes 26 science-based actionable recommendations, including limiting fisheries to help the whales access their main prey, Chinook salmon, along with eliminating toxic chemicals that build up in their food chains and adopting enforceable underwater noise standards. As stated in the executive summary, undersea noise emanating from anthropogenic sources continues to pose a significant impediment to the population's recovery, exacerbating the impact of prey limitation by interfering with echolocation and successful foraging. Consequently, the panel recommended the prompt finalization and implementation of meaningful underwater noise reduction targets that are biologically relevant to southern resident killer whales. Recommendations for reducing acoustic and physical disturbance include develop and implement regional noise reduction targets that reflect southern resident killer whales' need for quiet time, communication space, and echolocation ability, and make them a requirement for future development approvals. Lance Barrett-Leonard, cetacean scientist with Raincoast Conservation Foundation, says there is no convincing reason to believe the whales, which are genetically distinct from other orcas, will recover without stronger measures. This report makes it clear there is an urgent need for more robust actions to save the southern resident killer whales from extinction. We have a fairly new federal government in Canada. The 2025 Independent Science Panel on Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery has outlined specific actions required to protect this species from current and future threats. Raincoast states the new government has a responsibility to act, and now it has the information it needs to do so effectively. Functional extinction trajectory. If you look at annual southern resident population census data, the future looks bleak if humans don't stop threatening the survival of this species. The orcanetwork.org shares combined J, K, and LPOD census data as of July 1st each year from the 1970s to date. In an article on this species' fraught relationship with humans, Neutberger shared that around 1970, southern resident killer whales were mass captured and taken for aquariums and aquatic acts. Until mass captures were banned in the mid-1970s, 53 southern resident orcas were taken. So when you look at the first census data back in the 70s, there was only 72 southern residents left in the wild. The population could have been over 100 southern residents if humans hadn't forcibly removed so many whales from their natural environment for our own entertainment. Deltaport 1 current threat. Since the 1970s, the annual data shows population recovery up to 98 whales by the mid-1990s. Mass captures stopped. Humans were starting to act on threats to the whale's ecosystem, like lowering underwater chemical pollution from PCBs. The census data shows a clear recovery trajectory, but after the mid-1990s, you can see a sharp drop in numbers. Total population in 2025 is now back to around 74 whales, compared to 72 in 1970. JPOD actually has fewer whales now than in the 1970s. Experts report that the 25% decline in southern resident killer whales in the mid to late 1990s corresponded to a decline in Chinook salmon, their preferred food. What happened in the mid-1990s to impact the salmon and southern resident population? Consider this. Roberts Bank Terminal 1, or Deltaport 1, was built in southern resident critical habitat in 1970, expanded operations in 1997, and doubled capacity in 2009. This project was built landside and offshore near Roberts Bank on a 210-acre, or 85-hectare, artificial human-made island in the Salish Sea. Roberts Bank is now the largest and busiest container shipping terminal in Canada. The southern resident killer whale population census data strongly suggest that the environmental impact of Deltaport 1 was, and continues to be, a significant factor in threatening the southern resident killer whale population recovery. Deltaport 2 imminent threat. To make the bright extinction risk worse, in 2023, plans were approved to build the new Roberts Bank Terminal 2, or Deltaport 2 shipping terminal offshore, right near Deltaport 1 in the southern resident killer whales legally designated critical habitat. This isn't in Vancouver, where you see many container ships and tankers in English Bay using Port of Vancouver Second Narrows terminals. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will be about 30 kilometers south of Vancouver in Delta, BC, near the Tsawwassen Ferry Terminal. Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will be a future marine container terminal that will double shipping capacity on Canada's west coast and add 320 acres of usable waterfront industrial land by extending further into the Fraser River estuary at Roberts Bank. The largest salmon runs in the world migrate through this area, which is an important habitat for threatened Fraser River Chinook salmon. Construction will further stress the Fraser estuary, which has already lost more than 70% of its floodplain habitat. The Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project will include an estimated 5 years of dredging and construction for the new landside facilities and the new Deltaport 2 shipping terminal on an artificial island of over 250 acres, over 100 hectares. This shipping terminal island will be 3 miles offshore in the Salish Sea, right near Deltaport 1 again. The reason the artificial island will be 3 miles offshore is to supposedly protect the existing bird sanctuary and critical bird habitat in this area, used by over 200 species like bald eagles, western sandpipers, snow geese, trumpeter swans, and raptors like gerfalcons. BirdLife International has recognized the Fraser River estuary, which includes Roberts Bank, as a globally significant important bird area because it is a major stop for millions of birds migrating along the Pacific Flyway annually. There is a permanent great blue heron rookery on Satsu Shores near Roberts Bank. It's debatable whether this important bird area will be protected enough. I think the goal is having another shipping terminal in deep waters to accommodate bigger ships and tankers. Canadian conservation and nature groups have been filing legal challenges to the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project for years. I also choose saving the southern resident killer whales from extinction over polluting marine infrastructure development that violates Canada's Species of Risk Act and Environmental Impact Assessment Act. Ignoring Species at Risk Act. Under the Species at Risk Act, Canada has a duty to protect endangered species from environmental threats caused by infrastructure development. Our federal government is ignoring that legislation when it comes to the southern resident killer whales. For over a decade, there have been legal challenges to the Deltaport 2 or Roberts Bank Terminal 2 megaport project. In 2018 and 2024, conservation organizations petitioned the federal government in Ottawa to implement an emergency order to protect the southern resident killer whales under the powers of the Species at Risk Act. The Species at Risk Act allows for emergency provisions to enact adequate recovery measures to address the abundance of their Chinook salmon prey, boat noise and disturbance, and underwater contaminants in their designated critical habitat. Eco-Justice has represented the conservation groups, including the David Suzuki Foundation, Georgia Strait Alliance, Natural Resources Defense Council, Raincoast Conservation Foundation, and World Wildlife Fund Canada in 2018, plus Living Oceans in 2024. Evidence submitted included increased noise and disturbance from constructing an artificial island in critical habitat will increase extinction risk by lowering feeding success. This project will result in 7 times more tanker traffic in the southern resident killer whale's critical habitat, with increased underwater noise, disturbance, and contaminants. Increased tanker traffic will increase risk of a catastrophic oil or bitumen spill in southern resident killer whale critical habitat. What did the Canadian government say in response to the 2018 and 2024 legal challenges? To quote the feds, project-related marine shipping is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects on the southern resident killer whale and on Indigenous cultural use associated with the southern resident killer whale. In 2018 and 2024, the feds issued findings stating these whales were at imminent risk of extinction. In 2018 and 2024, the Canadian government, our feds, denied the legal request for an emergency order to help save the whales because the significant adverse environmental effects were justified in the circumstances. In 2025, the Canadian Ministry of Transport issued its interim order for the protection of killer whales in the waters of southern British Columbia. Notice this is rightly for orcas in general to protect all coastal killer whale species, including the southern residents. But this order will not solve the threats from Roberts Bank Terminal 2. Like past protection orders, these include fishing closures in designated areas, vessel restricted zones, voluntary vessel slowdowns, and voluntary increase in distance vessels must stay back from killer whales. It's the same old, same old. The southern resident killer whale species won't recover under these conditions. There is no scientific proof that go-slow restrictions to lower shipping vessel underwater noise emissions will be enough to protect southern residents from extinction. This interim order falls far short of the essential 2025 southern resident killer whale recovery measures recommended by international scientists. In 2022, at a United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Montreal, Member of Parliament, the Honourable Steven Guilbeault, stated, "The health of our forests, oceans, animals, and all biodiversity underpins the very strength and stability of our societies. We cannot take that for granted. Now, it is time to deliver." Transport Canada has said it is committed to reducing underwater noise in the long term, including launching international initiatives to help benefit noise-sensitive marine species. This includes a coalition for a quiet ocean signed by Canada and Panama. This coalition's declaration states that it reflects a shared commitment to turning scientific consensus into political action. There is a huge disconnect between long-standing scientific consensus on mandatory actions needed for southern resident killer whale recovery and failure of political action in Canada. I'm disgusted that certain decision makers in our government are branding like they care internationally while justifying species extinction so Roberts Bank Terminal 2 can go ahead in the Salish Sea. In a 2023 article on Cabinet's decision to improve Roberts Bank Terminal 2, despite southern resident killer whale extinction science, Lucero Gonzalez Ruiz, Georgia Strait Alliance's biodiversity campaigner, stated, "Everyone is in agreement about the damaging effects this project will have on orcas' critical habitat and their main food source. And this project is increasing shipping and oil spill risk in the region at alarming rates. This is an emergency. So, why does the federal government continue to choose marine infrastructure development in the Salish Sea over the health of communities in our shared climate?" Charlotte Daw, conservation and policy campaigner at Wilderness Committee, stated, "This project is harmful on many levels. It will negatively impact life-giving ecosystems, species at risk, First Nation cultural use, public health, and jobs, as automation will replace dock workers. The Port of Vancouver are the only ones set to benefit immensely from this project. The federal government seems to have forgotten that they are supposed to govern for the interests, safety, and welfare of the public, not the pockets of corporations." Dinah Tweedle, staff lawyer, Ecojustice, stated, "The federal government has publicly acknowledged that the southern resident killer whales already face imminent threats to their survival and recovery under current conditions. Approving Terminal 2's additional impacts in critical habitat, while the government has no credible plan to address existing problems, makes a mockery of the Species at Risk Act, which is supposed to protect this iconic species. Bypassing environmental impact assessment laws." How are provincial and federal governments in Canada getting away with bypassing species at risk and environmental impact assessment laws? There has not been a provincial or federal underwater or marine environmental impact assessment to determine specific risks to southern resident killer whales from the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. The project still requires Species at Risk Act compliant Fisheries Act authorization. This permitting process is the last significant hurdle for the project prior to advancing to a final investment decision. The government expects this to happen in 2026. It's very challenging to imagine how Roberts Bank Terminal 2 could pass the required Fisheries Act environmental impact assessment. Jeffrey Young, Senior Science and Policy Analyst at the David Suzuki Foundation, says, "Extensive independent review based on scientific evidence has shown that this megaport would result in irreversible harm to Chinook salmon and the southern resident killer whales that depend on them." How do we reach this point, then, of authorities failing to protect an endangered species in their legally designated critical habitat? Nature Canada reports that bills put forward by the federal government, Bill C5, and British Columbia, Bill 15, give governments the authority to bypass environmental assessment laws. This has allowed for vaguely defined national interest projects, provincially significant projects, and projects in special economic zones. When it comes to the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 future project, the government rationale includes strengthening future trade competitiveness and economic growth. A 2023 Georgia Strait article discusses Cabinet's decision to approve Roberts Bank Terminal 2 while ignoring science. In light of the dramatic and irreversible environmental impacts this project will have on Chinook salmon and endangered killer whales, this project should never have been given the green light. Stephen Hazel with Nature Canada states that governments can't just waive environmental laws whenever they feel like it. Nature Canada and West Coast Environmental Law will be going to court soon in a legal case to defend Canada's environmental laws. They are going to argue that Canada's Environmental Impact Assessment Act is both necessary and constitutional. Nature Canada states that the Act allows federal regulators to study and limit potential harm from major resource projects in areas of federal jurisdiction to our environment, our health, and our climate. It requires governments to look before they leap, to consider environmental impacts before approving these major projects. Environmental laws like this Act stand between us and runaway destruction of nature. Meanwhile, in a classic case of jumping the gun, in July 2025, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority put out requests for Roberts Bank Terminal 2 construction bids with a deadline of September 2025 for submissions. The winning construction company bid will include a 44-hectare expansion of the terminal for handling containers, a 560-meter berth extension, a 12-hectare expansion of the existing rail yard, and a barge berth to accommodate future potential demand. So the new megaport project hasn't completed environmental impact assessments, it's not even built yet, and they're already planning for increased capacity. It's estimated it will take about 5 years to build the Deltaport 2 Island, with construction expected to begin in 2028 and operations beginning around 2033. It sure seems like the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority expects no issues with this project proceeding. It's like Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is a done deal with no problems anticipated around the required provincial and federal permits and environmental impact assessments. I'm not a marine biologist, but it seems abundantly obvious that adding a huge artificial island plus increased shipping and tanker traffic through the southern residents' critical ecosystem can only tip the balance towards faster extinction. All marine and terrestrial environmental impact assessments should have been done long before any project approvals. There's another legal protest with the BC Environmental Assessment Office listed as one of the respondents. The Lummi Nation, based in Washington State, is taking the BC government to court for not consulting the nation about this Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority infrastructure project. The Lummi Nation first petition on the future shipping terminal was filed in 2024, although that BC Supreme Court decision is still pending. This second petition for a judicial review in BC Supreme Court was filed on September 29, 2025. The court documents state that Lummi asserts it is an Aboriginal Peoples of Canada with Section 35 rights in BC, meaning Lummi is an Aboriginal society that occupied now Canadian territory at the time of European contact and is entitled to be consulted on Crown decisions that may adversely impact their asserted rights. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that according to Section 35, US-based tribes may have both substantive rights, such as hunting, fishing, and Aboriginal title, and procedural rights to consultation. Like some other Coast Salish nations, the Lummi Nation's traditional territory includes numerous villages, harvesting, cultural, and spiritual sites on both sides of the border. Canadian decision makers don't seem to recognize that biodiversity and a thriving ecosystem are essential for future economic growth in British Columbia. The Pacific Northwest of Canada and the USA is an area of outstanding natural beauty that draws tourists from around the world. A 2021 report states bird watching in the Fraser River Delta generates $11 million annually to the local economy. In 2022, the capture fishery, aquaculture, fish processing, and sports fishing sectors contribute a real combined gross domestic product of over $1 billion to the BC provincial economy. In Tourism Research British Columbia, the BC government reported the 2023 economic value of tourism to jobs, businesses, and the provincial economy included tourism-generated revenues of over $22 billion. This includes whale watching, birding, sea kayaking, and fishing in the Fraser River Estuary, Salish Sea, and coastal waters. Destination BC reports Indigenous tourism, including cultural experiences and wildlife viewing, generates over $1 billion annually. A 2024 report, Economic Impacts of Pacific Whale Watch Association Tourism in the Salish Sea, stated the total economic value of Salish Sea whale watching tourism in BC contributes up to $300 million annually. Our brand is Supernatural British Columbia. There is no legal or just reason to destroy our province's natural ecosystems, designated critical habitats, and endangered southern resident killer whales. Oil or bitumen spill environmental disaster. Maybe you don't care about the endangered salmon or imminent extinction of southern resident killer whales. Maybe you don't care about the threatened important bird area in the Fraser River estuary near Roberts Bank. Do you care about an oil or diluted bitumen spill that would destroy tourism and make BC coastal marine ecosystems uninhabitable for extended periods of time? Increased shipping from a future Roberts Bank Terminal 2 would increase the risk of a catastrophic spill in the Salish Sea and Pacific Ocean. Consider other marine disasters, including the Deepwater Horizon event in the Gulf of Mexico, the Exxon Valdez catastrophe in Alaska, and a 2016 oil spill off the BC coast near Bella Bella, which is still negatively impacting the ecosystem. A 2013 report by NOAA Research and Planning Group on West Coast Spill Response Study, commissioned by the BC government, indicated that response to a BC oil spill would be devastatingly slow and incomplete. The government concluded more federal resources are needed to protect the West Coast. A Canadian National Academy of Science report states, when all risks are considered systematically, there must be a greater level of concern associated with spills of diluted bitumen compared to spills of commonly transported crude oils. Dilbit, or bitumen, from the Alberta oil sands, is a tar or dense toxic version of crude oil. In a past article from Common Sense Canadian on the, at that time, predicted 40 to 80 billion cleanup cost of an oil spill near Vancouver, BC, Rex Weiler describes how bitumen contains sulfur, paraffins, asphaltics, benzenes, and other toxic compounds. Animals and plants are suffocated and poisoned. The die-off starts at the foundation of the food chain, obliterating the vital mudflat biofilm, the bacteria, diatoms, and mucopolysaccharides that provide a high-energy food source for shorebirds. As the bitumen moves with wind and tides, it kills all bottom life, mixes with the intertidal sediments, and kills shellfish, ocean plants, finfish, and marine mammals. The oil and gas industry doesn't care about spills because they avoid responsibility. Most oil spilled into the world's bays, harbors, and marine environments is what's called normal spillage, acknowledged by the industry as a routine expense which they write off as a tax deduction. Oil and pipeline companies have indemnified themselves and decline liability once oil or bitumen is on a ship. Mr. Whaler states the response cost would fall to Canadians, municipalities, the province, the federal government, that is, to the people. Imagine a minimum 40 to 80 billion Canadian taxpayer bill to mop up a predicted and preventable marine and economic disaster in British Columbia. Describing other proposed BC pipeline projects, Marilyn Slett, president of the Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative and the elected chief of the Heiltsuk Tribal Council, said the risk of a catastrophic oil spill in BC's coastal waters is not nation building. Existing pipelines from Alberta, Canada are already bringing bitumen and oil to BC shipping terminals, including Roberts Bank. A diluted bitumen spill presents significant challenges because while it initially floats, weathering can increase its density, causing it to sink and become difficult to detect and remove from water bodies. The spilled product releases toxic fumes and contaminates marine and freshwater ecosystems, harming aquatic life and posing health hazards to humans and terrestrial animals. In 2010, an Enbridge bitumen pipeline originating from Canada's oil sands spilled in Michigan's Kalamazoo River. It has cost over $1 billion to date in cleanup and remediation measurements, but the environment is still contaminated. It is the costliest onshore oil spill in U.S. histories. Experts state that there's still an enormous amount of diluted bitumen at the bottom of that river because it was deemed too difficult and too potentially harmful to remove. So it's there forever. Imagine how much harder it will be to clean up a spill offshore in the Pacific Northwest. In addition to the years and billions needed for cleanup and remediation of a future oil or bitumen spill offshore, BC would be devastated. It would impact transportation and travel for everyone using our BC ferries and other ferry infrastructures. Tourism would be hit hard. After the Exxon Valdez spill, the Alaska tourism industry lost 26,000 jobs and over $2 billion immediately, and another $2.8 billion over the next decade for a total loss of over $5 billion. After the Gulf oil spill, locals reported tourism is dead. Again, British Columbia brings in over $22 billion annually in tourism, including whale watching, birding, and sea kayaking in the Fraser River estuary and Salish Sea. Imagine the millions of local and migrating shorebirds and waterbirds using the Pacific Flyway, negatively impacted for years by an oil or bitumen spill. In the older Common Sense Canadian article, BC fisherman Ron Fowler, a Pacific Salmon Commissioner at that time and director of the Area F Trollers Association, said, "If we get an oil spill anywhere in these waters, it would wipe out every fishery we have. Shellfish, salmon, herring, and the plankton that they feed on. An oil spill would move with the wind and tides and devastate the intertidal zones. The potential fisheries loss over several years would lose billions for our BC economy." Let's add in the health costs of a spill. In Michigan, after the Kalamazoo River bitumen spill, 60% of locals reported nausea, dizziness, headaches, coughing, and fatigue for weeks after the spill. The toxic fumes remained for weeks and could be smelled up to 50 kilometers away. Experts predict a spike in cancer and other diseases. A bitumen spill near Burrard Inlet or the Salish Sea would likely cause a mass evacuation of the BC coast and Gulf Islands, plus severe health impact for millions. Rex Whaler reported, giving our normal tides and winds, the crude oil, or bitumen, would be in Nanaimo, Sechelt, and the southern Gulf Islands within a few days. Stanley Park would be devastated. After a bitumen spill, the toxins would contaminate the entire marine ecosystem from Seattle to Campbell River and beyond. Most of this damage could not be cleaned up at any price. 2 years after the Michigan spill, 30 miles of the Kalamazoo River remained closed to fishing, swimming, or even wading in the water. Imagine our coastal waters closed to fishing, swimming, or wading. We certainly wouldn't be beautiful or supernatural BC anymore. How can we even put a dollar value on that? Mr. Whaler states that such a spill would destroy the heart of our province. He says, "There is no price to cover the soul of this region, the promises of Indigenous rights, the food we take from this water, the childhoods on our beaches, the families of creatures and forests of fauna, the identity of this city and region, our heritage, and our dignity." Why do I care so much about saving the southern resident killer whales from imminent extinction? I've lived on the south coast of BC for most of my life. The southern residents have been a constant, especially in the summer months, whether you're viewing them from shore, ferries, boating, or fishing. In 2009, I took my partner on a whale watching tour in the Salish Sea to celebrate his 50th birthday. It ended up being a magical, spiritual experience that is burned into my memory. We were blessed to see the rare sight of J, K, and L pods all together in a superpod. The captain of the boat turned off the engines and stopped approaching at the required distance after spotting the whales. But the superpod of southern residents stayed right near the boat for over an hour while their calves swam and played, diving under one side of the boat and popping out the other. A spark was born in my heart that day for southern resident killer whales, and it would break my heart if they go extinct. The calves I saw that day were named Cousteau, Seichin, and Moby, and they are still alive as of 2025. But in 2019, I was volunteering for the Right to Quiet Society, based in BC, Canada. I attended a Rain Coast Conservation Foundation live stream on the future of southern resident killer whale recovery. I wanted to transcribe it to share the content with people who couldn't make the live stream or who can't hear enough to understand the content or the discussion. This live stream really helped educate me on the issues facing this critically endangered species and how scientists are recommending specific actions to help save the whales. In 2019, I never imagined that subsequent governments in Canada would ignore the Species at Risk Act and the Environmental Impact Assessment Act to proceed with marine infrastructure development for international shipping in the southern resident killer whales' legally designated critical habitat. I never imagined Canadians, including folks in BC, would fail to protect this unique endangered species from extinction. In 2025, the killer whale emerged victorious as BC's best symbol, with over 500,000 votes cast from the BC public. But a recent article by Pascale Campagna-Slater at Rain Coast Conservation Foundation talks about the irony. Southern resident killer whales, emblematic of British Columbia, desperately need our help. Will we do more than vote them best emblem? Will we fight to defend them from extinction? Because 500,000 letters to government decision makers would go a long way to safeguard this irreplaceable species. Sir David Attenborough said, "If we save the sea, we save our world." His ocean documentary makes it clear that oceans continue to be the primary source of resources essential for life, and that marine protected areas benefit marine life, people, and our climate. I want to save the southern residents, the Salish Sea, and Pacific Ocean for future generations. What would I do? If I had the power, I would issue an immediate emergency order under Canada's Species at Risk Act to halt the future Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. I would make sure no development projects proceed in the Salish Sea or Roberts Bank without first doing legally required marine and land-based environmental impact assessment. We have marine protected areas on BC's north coast. There is an interim sanctuary zone for southern resident killer whales near the Pender Whale Sanctuary underwater listening station. Couldn't we make a permanent sanctuary zone or marine protected area as recommended by scientists and conservationists? If I could wave a magic wand, I would enforce acoustic protection and all other 26 southern resident recovery measures recommended by the International Panel of Scientists. I would turn long-standing scientific consensus into political action. I would do everything in my power to prevent this tragedy so our unique, irreplaceable species of southern resident killer whales could still share the earth with future generations. I wish pristine seas would help influence Canada to create a Salish Sea National Park or protected marine reserve. Pristine Seas is an exploration, research, and filmmaking project that inspires the creation of marine protected areas around the world. Founded and led by National Geographic Explorer-in-Residence Enrique Sala, the project has helped to create 29 of the largest marine reserves on Earth, which preserves the wonders of the ocean while increasing the food supply, providing economic benefits, and building resilience against global warming. President Zelensky of the Ukraine is famously quoted as saying, "Don't hang my portrait in your offices. Hang there the pictures of your children and look into their eyes before every decision." I urge BC and federal government decision makers to do the same for all decisions and policies threatening species extinction, biodiversity, and Canada's natural environment of outstanding beauty. Can provincial and federal government authorities look children and teenagers in their eyes and tell them you've decided to ignore science-based actions required for southern resident killer whale species recovery in their legally designated critical habitat? Don't forget to tell them you've ignored legislation and waived species at risk and environmental protections for the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project, even though this proves from science that this will cause southern resident killer whale extinction, loss of biodiversity, and increased risk of environmental disaster. I'm not against nation building, but Canada needs to stop pushing projects in British Columbia that threaten environmental devastation and the tragedy of our iconic southern resident killer whales going extinct. Canada also needs cleaner energy options instead of pushing oil and bitumen pipelines from Alberta to BC like they're going out of style. I don't think putting harmful, polluting infrastructure interests over protecting our natural ecosystems is the path to a strong, healthy Canada for future generations. I don't have the government's power to save the whales. I'm just an old retired audiologist with health problems who barely leaves home. So I've done what I can. I've sent my letter to government decision makers and will keep trying to raise awareness. Are there other people in BC, Canada, and around the world who also care enough to act? Please send a letter. If you're wondering what you can do, Susan Berta of the Orca Network says, "We are all intricately connected, from tiny plankton to forage fish, salmon, orcas, tall firs and cedars, mountains, rivers, and the ocean. It is time to reflect, to reconnect, and to respond as better caretakers of our planet. Even though they are perilously close to extinction, it's not too late to turn the tide and save the southern resident killer whales. It will take scientists, bold, urgent government decisions, and a community of people who want to protect and defend marine ecosystems and biodiversity for future generations." The Canadian government estimates for every one letter, 1,000 people feel the same way. Could you call, write, or email on behalf of the southern resident killer whales? Contact the government, call your MP, call your local politicians and reps, especially in BC. Demand politicians uphold Canada's Species at Risk Act and Environmental Impact Assessment Act with an actionable timeline to protect critically endangered southern resident killer whales and their legally designated critical habitat. Demand government tackle primary extinction threats by making all 26 recommendations mandatory from the Independent Science Panel on Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery 2025, strengthening recovery actions for southern resident killer whales. Demand projects in BC and Canada that respect our marine and intertidal ecosystems and our economy without threatening ecological disasters like southern resident killer whale extinction. I sent letters to government decision makers, including Prime Minister Mark Carney, BC Premier Mr. David Eby, Minister of Fisheries Joanne Thompson, Minister of Canadian Identity and Culture Steven Gibault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Julie Dabroussin, and Secretary of State for Nature Nathalie Provost. This is a sample of my letter. Hello, Prime Minister Carney. My province's brand is Supernatural British Columbia. I was very happy to see Canada recommit to halt and reverse nature loss and protect 30% of Canadian land and ocean by 2030. Funding Canada's 2030 nature strategy will help turn promises into action. It gives me hope that you will take the bold and urgent actions needed to protect our critically endangered southern resident killer whales from imminent extinction. I urge you to 1. Turn science into action. Southern residents are an ecosystem indicator. This unique species is not recovering under current polluted conditions. Emergency action is needed to halt the Port of Vancouver Fraser Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project that will devastate their ecosystem by adding more disturbance and pollution with a new artificial island shipping terminal 3 miles offshore in the whale's legally designated critical habitat. 2. Ensure all federal and provincial required marine environmental impact assessments are completed as required under species at risk and environmental impact assessment legislation, including specific threats to southern resident killer whales and their salmon food source. 3. Take bold, urgent action on primary extinction threats by making all 26 recommendations mandatory from the Independent Science Panel on Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery, 2025, strengthening recovery actions for southern resident killer whales, including improve quality, abundance, and access to prey, reduce physical and acoustic disturbance, reduce priority contaminant discharges, limit risks of a catastrophic oil or bitumen spill. 4. If the future Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project can't pass essential marine environmental impact assessments, and if it fails to meet required southern resident killer whale recovery goals recommended by international scientists, this project should not go ahead. 5. Establish a South Coast Marine Protected Reserve in southern resident habitat. 6. Invest in a healthy, climate-safe, sustainable future over infrastructure and industries fueling the current environmental pollution crisis. Protecting our precious marine wildlife in their legally designated critical habitat around the Salish Sea will help improve ecosystem health and maintain biodiversity for future generations. This is essential for a sustainable future in British Columbia, with our economy currently earning billions annually in tourism revenues. $22.1 billion 2023 economic value of tourism to jobs, businesses, and the provincial economy from Tourism Research, British Columbia. This includes whale watching, birding, sea kayaking, and fishing in the Fraser River estuary near Roberts Bank, Salish Sea, and coastal waters. Over $1 billion annual economic value of Indigenous tourism, including cultural experiences and wildlife viewing from Destination BC, and $300 million 2024 economic value of Salish Sea whale watching tourism from the economic impacts of Pacific Whale Watch Association tourism in the Salish Sea. We need sustainable jobs for the future, not shipping terminals, pipelines, or infrastructure projects that devastate nature and wildlife for generations to come. Please let me know how southern resident killer whales will be better protected as we look towards a healthier and more resilient future for all. Sincerely, Jan. I know that letter's too long and probably nobody's going to read it, but I'm going to think positive. I'm going to think that it'd be more than just me fighting to save these whales. What else can you do? Well, please share this with other people who believe we should be caretakers of our planet Earth and safeguard all species. Follow conservation groups like the David Suzuki Foundation and Raincoast Conservation Foundation for updates on southern resident killer whale recovery and any community campaigns. I know Greta Thunberg is very busy, but if you happen to know her, perhaps you could encourage her to pencil in the Salish Sea for 2028 activism against Roberts Bank Terminal 2 construction, which is supposed to start in 2028. If needed, I'll join any protest too. So, as described by Newt Berger, we should all have a sense of collective guilt over what we have done to threaten the southern resident killer whales. I can live with myself by trying my best to raise awareness to help save the whales. Together it is possible. It's not too late. Not yet. As Dr. Jane Goodall says in her final message on hope for planet Earth, let's fight to the very end. I'm working on some more southern resident killer whale content, talking about their environmental pollution threats and recovery action plan science. Stay tuned. And thanks for any support you can give the whales, and quiet cheers.